In this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast, I'm joined by Eric DeGotti to discuss movement systems, movement screenings, considerations for program design, and so much more. This episode is jam packed with all kinds of valuable information that is guaranteed to provide valuable insight to any strength coach, trainer, therapist, chiropractor, or student who's interested in the fields of exercise science, athletic training, physical therapy, chiropractics, or sports in general. When it comes to functional movement and human movement, you won't find many people more qualified to talk about it than Eric. Eric has spent the last 20 years in the fitness industry as a coach, trainer, and instructor, pioneering his unique approach to client assessment, performance enhancement, and injury prevention. His company, One Human Performance, provides fitness training and wellness services in the state of New Jersey, and he's operated a multidisciplinary facility for 12 years. He has since moved on to focus solely on coaching and consultation services in addition to education. He actually is an instructor for the Functional Movement System ConEd course, which I'll link to below. Before we get to this awesome episode with Eric, quick word from one of our sponsors.
Eric, welcome to the show. Excited to have you on today.
Thanks for having me.
So, for those who aren't familiar with you, could you share a little bit about yourself and the kind of clients that you work with?
That's a loaded question to start with, Dan. So the type of clients I work with kind of varies, and I'll kind of backtrack it with the first question of a little bit of my background. So I've been in the strength and conditioning and performance world for over 20 years. And so with that, along the way, I've done a lot of different roles within that, from owning my own facility for 12 years to hands-on, training and coaching with both individuals as well as teams. To this day, I still work with and contract with different high schools for working with their teams, as well as a consultant for different organization teams that will bring me in. That's a part of what I do. And then the other half of it is the education that I provide, going out and teaching around the world. I've been a lead instructor for functional movement systems for the past 15 plus years, as well as develop my own content that I've got to go out and teach internationally as well.
That's an incredible resume. And you've really learned from some of the best in the business, from the likes of Gray Cook, Charles Poliquin, Mike Clark. You have a very impressive background. Now, when it comes to the people you've worked with and the high caliber people that you help on a regular basis, whether they be professional athletes or Navy SEALs or the like, what do you feel has been your key to success when working with these clients from a training standpoint?
I would say the biggest thing is finding out more about them, kind of what not only makes them tick, but also what they need. And asking what we call the key questions, and finding out what is it that got them here in the first place. First question in the door is always, why are you here? And then from there it's peeling that back to say, okay, why? I'm like a 4-year-old, and I say there's always 4 why, a minimum of 4 whys until I actually get to the real answer. That before I can even answer you. So finding out, okay, well, I want to get faster. Okay, well, what does that mean to you? Well, what is, why are you not fast now? And keep asking questions like that. And then we can start to figure out where we start. So you don't walk in and then it's not Eric's program. That would make my life a lot easier if I just had a handbook and I gave it to you. But finding out where do I direct you on the path? There's where you are now, and there's where you want to be, and what are the links, the weak links that are holding you back from being there, or you be there already?
Right. I completely agree with you. Your ability to assess a client determines ultimately the success that client is going to experience, right? Like you said, you can't just take a client and put them on a cookie cutter program and expect everything to work out swimmingly. You can't just have someone walk in the door who says, I want to get faster. You make them push a sled, squat, and deadlift, and they're going to get faster. That's not how it works. Every single person is different. They have unique needs and unique differences in how they move. You mentioned before that you do a lot of instructing for functional movement systems, FMS, and that is a great way to help screen athletes and clients and determine what specifically they need. So just starting off, what is the FMS for people who haven't heard of it before?
Okay, so the FMS, or the functional movement screen, is, it checks one box of all the boxes that I need to check on my checklist of things that that are essential for you to get to where you want to be. And what we don't really have, or what we didn't have, going back into the late '90s when the FMS was created, was a biomarker for movement. We had a kind of changing of tides, as we always do in our industry, where it went from a more bodybuilding machine based type of structure in most facilities, and then you saw this wave come in where functional training became the cool thing. And it started with people like Vern Gambetta, and then followed up by Juan Carlos Santana, and all these people who became big in terms of selling that we need more functional training. And we were doing functional training, but we didn't have a gauge to know if it's even working. Like, if I'm doing speed training, it's pretty simple. Did I get faster, right? If I'm doing strength training, did I get stronger? Well, if I'm doing functional training, how do I know if I'm getting more functional? What does that even mean? And what is my baseline to know if I even need it in the first place? And so a physical therapist by the name of Gray Cook came up with this concept of looking at movement holistically and looking at it in terms of patterns, and being able to say, okay, well, what are the patterns that everybody should do? What are the minimums in terms of movement, in terms of competency, that everybody should pretty much be able to meet? And so what that would then serve as a filter for the person coming either into rehab, or the person coming into a strength and conditioning environment, to say, well, before we even look at how we challenge you from a physiological standpoint, from a movement standpoint, you at least meet these minimums. Now, with that, came this movement screen that was created in the late '90s, early 2000s. And then since that point, it has evolved tremendously, and been used a lot of different ways, and also been misused and misunderstood in a lot of other ways. It was originally designed as part of high school pre-participation physicals. And so one of the co-founders, Lee Burton, is an athletic trainer, and wanted to have something that he could filter out to figure out what is some of the commonalities of the kids that I see in my athletic training room every single day. And then there's other kids that never come in here. Why are some kids more in quote unquote injury prone and other kids are more durable? And is there a movement factor in there? And that's where it kind of started out. And then from there, it evolved to where it started getting used in professional sports. And then it started getting used with the military. And then it's expanded beyond that as our reach has expanded, and where it's expanded to where now it's in general fitness. And now you're starting to see it in corporate work settings. And so the end user has changed dynamically, or dramatically, I should say. But the main concept of just looking at you meet your basic movement minimums has pretty much stayed the same.
Right. And your ability to do those basic minimum movements is essential for everyone, like you said, right? One of the key movements that the system looks at, from what I've learned about it, is the squat. And if you can't squat properly with just your body weight, then should you walk into the weight room and load up 400 or 500 pounds and attempt to squat? Likewise, if you can't even squat your body weight normally, and you work maybe a blue collar job, construction site, something like that, where you're lifting up 40, 50 pounds consistently over and over and over again, that will eventually take its toll on you and cause pain and set you up for a variety of different health implications down the line. So I love the simplicity approach that this uses. And I'm sure you can speak to the fact that it's incredible the people that you see, you give this screening to, that, maybe they're a high caliber athlete or high level, and they struggle with some of these basic things.
Yeah, and that's because they're great on the field, the court, the mat, the ice, the whatever stage that they work on. They're great in spite of themselves, not because of what they do. And so that you can still be really, really good in a sport or an activity and not have good movement competency. It's only one box of many that we need to check. Now, what we have found is that the people who don't move well, who score poorly, they generally tend to break down. They also tend to not come back as quick when they do get hurt or they get injured. Now that unfortunately sometimes gets extrapolated into saying, well, we predict or prevent injury. And that's not the case. What I'm looking for is to see, are there certain risk factors you will have? And movement competency in the FMS is just one of those things. We also look at your motor control through something like a Y balance test or a motor control screen. Plus we look at other factors in terms of lifestyle factors, in terms of a lot of different things in your physical capacities, and all that together in an algorithm. Then I can have a better idea of who I can predict is going to get hurt or who's not going to get hurt. This, what it does in terms of preventing injuries, is it helps me from injuring you. Let me explain that. If you come to me as a client, right, and we want to start training on day one, and let's say, like you said, you don't have the ability to even do a deep squat, even if I gave you a downgraded, modified version of that squat, you still can't control your body enough to get into a deep squat. Now, that doesn't predict anything in terms of your athletic performance. It doesn't predict that you're going to get hurt. What it tells me is, kind of like you said, is probably the best choice for day one is not going to be loading a bunch of weight onto you, or a bunch of repetitions or volume onto you of that movement pattern. And it doesn't mean you're never going to do it again. It means I'm going to temporarily take pause. And the first thing I'm going to do is, before I throw a bunch of corrective exercises at you, and that's the other misconception, is that this is about finding a reason to prescribe a bunch of corrective exercises. And I don't even really use that term a whole lot in terms of a corrective exercise. The first thing I need to do is remove the negative and say, okay, well, let's at least not make this worse. So when it's injury prevention, it's making sure that I don't hurt you, right? And so the joke I say is, like, people talk about injuries. Well, you can walk outside, get hit by a bus tomorrow, right? Well, yeah, of course you could, but I'm not going to be the one pushing you in front of the bus. And so with that, I'm going to make sure I'm not the one who hurts you. There's people getting hurt in weight rooms every single day. And sometimes that's inflicted by the coach, the trainer, because they didn't take the time to take pause to say, well, what is it that you're qualified to do? What is it that you shouldn't be doing? Because as much as we're looking at the things that you might want to avoid temporarily until we can fix those movement deficiencies, and if we do need to fix them, they usually only take a week or two to fix. This is not a death sentence of years on end of corrective exercise. But it also tells me what you can do. So let's say you're great at everything except for your deep squat. I still have a laundry list of hundreds of different things I could do to challenge you, where you're still going to get a great workout. I can still get you to your goal while I'm addressing this stuff at the same time.
Right. And that's what makes a great trainer, right? Is the ability to pick out those impairments and then program accordingly around them. But as you said, you have to be able to pick out movement dysfunction. So how do you know when a movement is impaired? What kind of signs are you looking for? Let's say with the squat, for example, since we were working with that before, if you're analyzing a squat, what signs are you looking for that indicate some kind of movement dysfunction?
So if we look at the deep squat in terms of and how the movement screen looks at it, is that we have different criteria that you have to meet, and we do it with an overhead squat. And can you even get in the position? Is the first thing. And then from there, we have a certain checklist that we go by in terms of, can you keep your feet straight? Can you keep your heels down? Can you keep your knees tracking properly? Can you get your torso and tibia parallel? A bunch of different things that we're going to look to say, if you can meet all that criteria, then we know that this is a passing score. But if you don't, we'll even modify it a little bit. We'll adjust your positioning and then see if you can do it again. And if you still can't do it, and you're breaking a bunch of these rules, then you know what, this is something that we need to take pause on. And we're gonna not only look to address some of those reasons that we find, but we're also going to remove that negative of not have you challenge that movement until we can get this at least to a passing acceptable level. And so with that being said, that's only one piece of it. There are some systems that's all they look at is your deep squat. And there's some people that say, well, I just watch people squat. Well, there's a lot of moving parts when you look at that, from the fingertips to the toes, literally. And so I can't make any assumptions based on that. And if I start pointing out, well, this is tight and this is weak and this is, you're going to miss a lot of stuff, or you're going to waste a lot of time addressing stuff that doesn't need to be addressed. Because if you want to, do the go-to in the rehab and fitness world of, it's tight hip flexors and weak glute medius, right? We could change the world if we just made everybody's hip flexors looser and then strengthen their glute medius. Well, those same muscles are also used in a lunge. They're also used in single leg standing. They're also used in hip hinging. They're also used in a bunch of other things. And so if I test all these different movements, and the only time I'm finding these tight things or weak things is in a deep squat, it's not anything tight or weak. It's that pattern is something that you don't know how to handle. And so that's a more global patterning issue. Now, if I find that every test that we go through, I keep seeing a lack of hip extension, well, we may have some restriction in your hip flexors. But that has to be, but I have to see that keep coming up, because now we start peeling this back, we have to figure out, do we have a global movement issue? Do we have a more regional control mobility issue? Or do I have a local problem? And unfortunately, a lot of the places we start, whether it's in our world now, because we went in and stole a bunch of stuff from physical therapy, or in the rehab world, we like to blame a part and say, okay, well, this is a local problem. It's the ankle, where it may be a regional problem and it's the whole lower quarter, or maybe a global problem that if you just taught this person to squat properly, that ankle is no longer a restriction. So we have to kind of peel it back. And first, what level am I working at here?
And one of the things that you brought up there was that poor motion can really exist anywhere, but the poor movement pattern can only exist from the brain, right? You might have tightness in the hip flexor, say in a certain position, but that position might make everyone's hip flexors tight, right? If they are maximally lengthened, it might feel a little bit tight. You might have a weak glute med in certain positions, but in other positions, hey, maybe their muscle length is different and they're firing optimally. So you really have to go at this with the mindset of almost like neurological reprogramming more than just a biomechanical construct. At least that's what I'm taking from it.
Well, it works both ways. I can have a restricted ankle that now everything that's stacked on top of that has to work around that restriction, and that is the driver of a poor squat. Or I may have just an issue where I can't create the sequencing and timing necessary to put all those parts together and have them work at the right place at the right time. And so that's where we have to decipher out which is which, and that's where testing and evaluation is critical, because then I don't have to guess. I don't watch somebody do 3 squats and assume that I know everything about their movement or their structure or function. I'm just going to take note and say, okay, well, that's something I want to be aware of as we keep going. And then if I see commonalities that everything that involves dorsiflexion, this person seems to be challenged with, okay, well, let's take the guesswork out of it. Let's actually measure that. And if we see that, okay, well, this person has 10 degrees of dorsiflexion, well, then we may have a local issue. And now we need to jump at that and address that. Whereas you don't have to have the guesswork if you know the right path to follow and you have kind of the right questions to ask and keep asking why. So even if you said you do have tight hip flexors, my first question before and you say, well, what's a good stretch for that? I'm going to say, well, why are they tight in the first place? Because what if I stretch you and I make you worse? Because that could happen too, right? And so maybe those hip flexors are tight for a reason. That might be the only thing stabilizing your trunk and pelvis. And so if I go and stretch them, we make them worse. And I actually did you a disservice. So I'm always asking, again, I'm always going into a bunch more whys before I answer your question.
Right. You brought up a great point with the hip flexors, right? They, in some cases, might be the only thing stabilizing the trunk. Someone might have inhibition of the core and other deep subsystems. But how do you know whether or not it's a mobility problem or a stability problem? How can you kind of piece out what the root cause of that issue is?
That's a kind of never-ending quest that we're on, and there's certain ways you can tease it out. So the most simple way is look at it loaded versus unloaded. So if you're somebody that we can put you in a Thomas test position where you're basically laying back with your butt up at the front edge of the table and hug one knee to your chest and then let the other leg drop down. And if that's an unloaded position, it's a non-weight bearing position, and if that knee just drops right down and it has a nice spongy end feel to it, and it's hanging off the table and it's below parallel, then it's probably not a mobility issue, right? And so there we have to start to look at motor control concerns and looking and to see is it a stability and timing and sequencing issue. Now, let's say if it is springing up off of the table and you got this diving board looking thing for a hip flexor, but now we have to keep adding more questions. Okay, well, why is it that stiff? Is this something we've gotten from adaptive shortening because this person sits 12 hours a day hunched over a dining room table with a laptop? Or is this somebody that has repetitive overstress because they're a cyclist and it's come from that? Is it because there's soft tissue restrictions within there? Is it and so we have to start diving down even deeper to say, okay, well, what am I going to do about this? Because guess what? Your 30-second hip flexor stretch going up against a someone who cycles 20 miles a day or sits at a desk 12 hours a day is going to be like trying to empty the ocean with a Dixie cup. It's going to be a futile battle that you're going up against there.
As a mentor of mine has said it, we think in terms of duct tape and WD-40 here, right? If it needs to move more and it doesn't, we think WD-40. And if it moves too much, which is kind of rarely the case anymore from what I've seen in my experiences, we need more duct tape. We need to strengthen it. But like you're saying, there's almost like a third road to this. There's the potential for neurologic compensations to alter the muscle activity and muscle length in certain positions. So getting to that root cause of the problem, as you've said, is a huge ongoing battle. And that's something that really takes time to dive out. Now, if there's athletes or coaches listening, they might want to know, how long would it take me to get to the root cause of a problem? How long does it usually take someone like yourself to really dive to that cause of a movement dysfunction for one of your clients?
So I just follow a system, right? I always say in our world, there's kind of two types of people that are at the top levels, and some of the people that you mentioned earlier that I've had the good fortune to study with. There's people who are wizards, right? It's someone like a Gray Cook is a wizard who just thinks on a different plane, who can walk in a room and just watch you move for a couple minutes, and he can know all the right buttons to push. Whereas there's other people that are more systems managers, and that's me, in that I basically just have a really good checklist, and every time I learn something, I see how does that fit in my checklist, so I can go through and say, okay, well, if they can do this, then go this way. If they can do this, then go the other way. And then I just keep following down that path until we pulled it back till we see enough. Now, that being said, we have to see what takes hold. Now, if your mode of intervention as a PT is more manual work, if you're doing a spinal manipulation, you're doing a soft tissue intervention, you're doing kinesiotaping, or on my end, my main application is going to be exercise. So I need to see, is it making an impact? And now, how do I see if it's making an impact? Well, to take it back, I say there's really 5 main questions that we have to ask when we go into changing movement. First is, do you even need it, right? And that's a big step that people often miss. That's what screening comes into play, because you know what, movement screening also could find out that I don't need to fix anything, right? And so often, if we want to be these corrective exercise gurus, well, what if you have nothing to correct? You're out of work, right? So I'm not looking to correct things if they're moving just fine. So the first question is, do I even need this? Then the second question is going to be, when we go and figure out what it is you need to, where it is you need to address this movement, then we have to figure out if we apply certain interventions, right? And I'm going to do my best guess, because that's all we're doing. And I hate to peel back the curtain on our world, but we're really making best guesses based on experience. Is then I'm going to apply, in my case, exercises, and then I'm going to go back and retest that. And I want to see, did it get anywhere? Can you even get there? So if I'm working on your ankle dorsiflexion and we've done some drills for that, I'm going to go back and immediately retest that. Now, if I see that it's improving, it may not get to, it's not a magic wand. It may not get to where we want it to be, but I see it's improving. Well, that gives me the affirmation that we're on the right path, but more importantly, it gives the client or patient the right affirmation that, hey, this is going to work. I saw this much change in just a couple, minutes of doing this. Imagine if I did this every single day, a couple times a day. So that answers the next question of, can you even get there? Is this going to make an impact? Because let's say you're somebody, working in the NFL for years. Offensive linemen have tons of bony restrictions in their anterior ankle because they have 400-pound guys shoving them backwards and they're stomping down into active dorsiflexion the whole time. And they get a lot of bony restrictions. I'm not going to change that with an exercise. And you might not even be able to change it in a clinic. You may need to get surgical intervention. So I need to know, am I going to even be able to get there? And so that's a little bit of trial and error. And it's educated guessing trial and error, but does it make an impact? And then the next question is, well, the good news is it's going to get there if we did make a positive change. The bad news is you don't own that, right? You're just renting that new movement for a little while. The next question is, can you own that? Can you walk in the door without any prompting, without any intervention, without any rolling or stretching or any types of pre-activity? Can you show me that activity cold? And if you could do that, now you kind of own that. That's part of your new movement behavior. But that's not the last and most important question, is can you actually use it? Can you actually use that dorsiflexion when you're coming down the mound and delivering a pitch? Because if you can't, then all I did was get you good at exercise. I didn't necessarily get you back to where you need to be. And that's a big step that's missed on the other end, especially in rehab, where we get you to weight bearing and pain free, but you're not ready to go out and play a lacrosse tournament this weekend. You're not ready to go out and throw 90 miles an hour again. You're just enough where you've regained range of motion and you're pain free. So those are the questions that I ask. Now, that's a roundabout answer of how long does it take? If I don't see a somewhat of a change, if not a significant change in a week or two, I am changing paths and I'm digging deeper and figuring out I missed something. What did I miss? If this person's following the program and they're doing it correctly, we've missed something. We either missed something in our assessment, or we picked the wrong drills, or something's not working. I'm not letting you go six months, let alone 6 weeks, let alone 2 weeks, without stepping in and saying we need to change paths automatically.
And using the system that you have kind of described there, where you isolate the specific restriction. So we were using the ankle as an example. Let's say it's ankle dorsiflexion again. You isolate that the restriction is ankle dorsiflexion. So you start to retrain that movement at that joint, and then you begin to integrate it into other patterns through different drills and exercises, and then you apply it functionally to the specific sport demand or specific movement, like you said, throwing a pitch, blocking as an NFL lineman. And then if that restriction is persistent, like you said, you look above or below the chain. So maybe that restriction in ankle dorsiflexion isn't at the talocrural joint, at the ankle joint. Maybe it's at the subtalar joint, because you need inversion eversion in order to dorsiflex the ankle. Maybe it's above the chain. Maybe it's up by the knee. Maybe you have some hamstring tightness, for example, right? The biceps femoris gets a ton of attention as the tight hamstring muscle. And a lot of people forget that it attaches to the fibular head. So if you have tightness of the proximal attachment of a distal joint, right? That distal ankle is kind of like a brick and mortise in nature. So if you have tightness at the proximal end of the bone that forms the distal articulation, then naturally you'll have implications there as well. As you said earlier, all of the different components of the body are anatomically connected, and dysfunction in one place can cause dysfunction up or below the chain.
Yeah, and that's the whole concept of what we call regional interdependence. And so that concept being is, let's go back to the tight hip flexor. Realize that you have what's going on above and below it. If you have restricted dorsiflexion, well, how do you think you're walking without tripping over your feet the whole time? You have to then create more hip hiking and kind of yank your hip through every time. Or maybe, like you said, there's lack of stability up directly above that. And so we can't just address one without addressing the other. And the way it stacks is kind of this really elegant way of, we have these interchanges between mobile areas and stable areas. And where it goes wrong, you start to also see those same things. So where do we see at the ankle? We see a lot of lack of mobility in the ankle. for a number of reasons, but you see a lack of stability at the knee. And then you generally see a lack of mobility at the hip, but a lack of stability in the lumbar area, a lack of mobility in the T-spine and thorax, but a lack of stability in the shoulder. And so you start to see all these things stack on top. And so if you address one and don't address the other, and I just do T-spine mobility, but I don't have good, T-spine mobility, and I don't have good shoulder stability or trunk stability underneath it, it's probably going to be fleeting. You're not going to come back and own that movement.
Right. And that, again, just further emphasizes our point of the importance of a good movement screening and evaluation, because more often than not, most people will not think from a global regional interdependence perspective, right? If you have a baseball pitcher come into your clinic and they have elbow pain or shoulder pain, how many clinicians or coaches or trainers are looking at the spine? How many of them are looking at core strength and core stability, right? Because as you just lined out, it starts from the ground up. So whether that's lower quarters starting from the foot and ankle up the chain, or for the upper quarter starting from the spine, right? If you don't have a stable and mobile spine, then you're going to have compensatory movement patterns down the upper extremity. So again, that just further emphasizes the point, I think, of the importance of looking at everything. Now, for those interested in learning how to look at everything from a systematic approach, kind of like we've outlined, where can people find out more about first the FMS and other movement screen based systems?
Okay, so you can learn about the different tiers of the FMS, as well as the medical model that they built off of that called the SFMA. You can get all that through functionalmovement.com, and we have both virtual, we have live and in-person virtual courses, as well as online courses. But then realize that the FMS and the SFMA is just the bare minimum. Like, we're just looking at bare minimums, like you should be at least able to do this. And it's funny when I remember distinctly sitting in the office going through a report with the entire medical and training staff and the head coach of an NFL team. And I'm trying to explain what some of this stuff means. And I explained, okay, well, this is what a hurdle step is. And he's like, what do you mean? He goes, I have guys who can't do that. He goes, I could do that. How? I don't understand. We're paying millions of dollars for guys who can't do that. And so it's just the bare minimums, right? But what we look at in terms of norms and minimums and norms and extremes, we have to also understand we can't confuse the two. So like the amount of range of motion at the shoulder that a baseball pitcher requires, right? And we're looking for that full range of motion arc of probably about 135 degrees. The average Joe who's just going to Orange Theory and working out and trying to get fit, to look good in their jeans and play with their kids, like, they don't need that full arc. And so I can't set a norm up for that individual that's based on an extreme. Yet at the same time, I can't tell you confidently that if someone clears an FMS shoulder mobility screen, that they're ready to go out and throw a ball 90 miles an hour, because that would now be trying to hit an extreme based on a norm, right? So that's why the FMS is just a starting point. If I need to look at a more extreme specific movement screen, well, that's where we have things like, well, for baseball, because that's one of the big areas I work in, is On Base University, and looks at specific things that are needed to either to throw a ball on our pitching screen, or to hit a ball well and efficiently in a hitting screen. Or that's derivative of what was originally created by Dr. Greg Rose, is the TPI screen for golf, right? If we look at trunk rotation, the average person, and I joke with my clients, we'll check their trunk rotation. They'll say, is that good? I said, you have all the trunk rotation you need to be an accountant. But if you're going to go out and swing this long metal shaft really, really fast, close to 100 times this weekend, you need to turn that thing a bunch more. And because if not, that stress is going to land somewhere, or you're going to have to generate the force from somewhere. And it's going to be, at the very least, be inefficient, right? Can you still perform really well? Absolutely. I can give you names of people that have performed at the highest levels, and they don't move all that well. And sometimes that stiffness is a little bit to their advantage. Sometimes that also is what leads to their breakdown, or the fact that they can't stay healthy. But it's just one piece of looking at someone's efficiency, and it doesn't necessarily, again, predict their performance. It just tells me why they go about doing things the way that they go about them, why they may come over the top in their golf swing as opposed to going in the correct path, because they don't have another choice. And so their body's finding the path of least resistance. And the people that we see on TV playing sports at the highest level are people who are really, really good compensators in one way or the other. That's what makes them great. Their ability to adjust and adapt and be able to do that is what makes them great. And so we want to just funnel those abilities into the best channels, so we can build a durable performer that's resilient, performs at a high level. And then the other piece of the puzzle is, we're talking a lot about movement competency. There's also a whole nother side of this that looks at physical capacity. And a lot of people who get caught up in the corrective exercise world or in the rehab world forget that side, to say there's a certain amplitude of force that this person needs to be able to accept, absorb, and recycle and produce. And so if I don't understand the level at which they need to do that, the speed at which they do that, the volumes at which they need to do that, the frequency at which they need to do that, then I'm going to miss the boat as well. And it's not just looking at it from trying to mimic a baseball swing or a golf swing in the clinic or in the gym. It's to say, well, what are all the factors that go into the checklist of physical properties that you need and neurological properties that you need to perform at the highest level and stay injury free?
I love those points you just made. As you said earlier, it's all about why. And if you can get to the bottom of that question, like you said, peeling back almost like layers on an onion, so to speak, if you can really get to the bottom of that root cause, that's when you really become effective. And then, as you said just a second ago, specificity is crucial and often overlooked, right? We need a specific adaptation to the imposed demand. And maybe someone's, first or second rep of a body weight squat and a movement screen looks perfect, but they don't need to just be able to do that once or twice. They need to do the metabolic workload equivalent of doing that 50, 100, even 200 times, essentially in sport participation and competition. So being able to match the screening and the interventions that you have to the specific demands of that athlete and of that individual are crucial to their success, as you just said. And too often, physical therapy especially falls into that trap. And I'll pick on us a little bit because here I am, just wrapped up my coursework for my doctorate of physical therapy as we're recording this. We often give people cookie cutter sets of 3 sets of 10 straight leg raises, side lying leg raises. Maybe we throw an ankle weight on there, do some long arc quads, right? They're just kicking their leg out actively. And that might work in the first week or two for an older individual who doesn't really need a whole lot of new strength. But for our younger individuals, right, those in their teenage years, 20s, 30s, 40s, we have to actually load their tissues. We have to load their bodies. And if we're not loading them appropriately from an endurance standpoint, a load, a total time under tension, then we're really doing them a disservice and setting them up for increased injury risk in the future. I always look at ACL treatment protocols that way, right? Why is it that I want someone to come back from a post-op and be as strong as they were before? I'd rather have them be stronger than they were before, because clearly they weren't strong enough before to prevent injury. They weren't moving appropriately before to prevent injury. They had a faulty movement compensation somewhere, or something happened that created that valgus collapse moment at the knee and led to a injury. And being able to really tease out and individualize your assessments and your interventions, regardless of who you are, regardless of who you're working with, whether it be PT, chiropractics, strength coach, trainer. I mean, that is the bread and butter of what we do.
So again, it comes back to why, and it comes back to, so if I'm the rehab specialist, I'm the strength or fitness coach. I have to first ask, well, why? All right. So you have a history of an ACL injury. And so my first question is not, what exercises should I do for that? The first question is, why did you tear your ACL? Because I can think off the top of my head, I have a guy who's a pro soccer player who's torn his ACL 3 times, right? But all of them were non-contact. I have another kid who's a college football player who planted in a pile, helmet came in full speed, hit the lateral portion of his knee, and it buckled and blew out his ACL. So going through that same concept, and we have a something called the ethical principle that we talk about in FMS, and it's protect, correct, develop. And so the first thing to do is protect. So how do I protect you from happening this again? Well, it's a very different approach than I'm going to take with a soccer player, because I have to protect them by knowing that at the end of all this, you need to be able to decelerate, break down, change direction, amortize force, all that stuff that you couldn't the first time around, which is why the knee blew. And then I joke with the second guy, say, listen, the first thing you need to do is stop getting helmets in your knee, right? So maybe I just got to make them faster so nobody can catch them. But that's not something, that's part of the nature of the violence of the sport that he plays. And so it's going to be a little different rehab path for those two guys. And so with the protect, correct, develop thing, is that what I find is that your rehab world is pretty good at the protect, sometimes a little overprotective, quite frankly, not understanding what the world is this person has to go back to. And having realistic timelines, because they're going to figure out a way back on the field or court. And it's your job to make that efficient and effective so that when they do, that they're best ready for that. But on the other end, the develop part, you're not real good at that, right? And we leave people not truly ready to return to action and play. On my side of the fence is we're really good at the develop part for the most part, but we're not really good at the protect part. We don't first ask, we always look at what exercises can I do, should I do, but we don't ask which ones should I not do, which ones are not appropriate. And so I now have, with holiday break, I have a bunch of college kids that just walked out the door. They're home on break and they hand me their school programs. My job is not to be the pompous jerk who says that program sucks, you're doing my program. I have to at least look at the outline of the program and say, okay, well, I can see what this strength coach is looking to do with you, but I'm going to make some modifications because that strength coach didn't do a move and screen, didn't do any kind of performance testing with you, and is doing this as a generic program for the 50, 60, maybe 100 kids in your program. So it's not individualized. I have the freedom to do that. And so I'm just going to make some modifications to make this more individualized to you. But there are also, we keep talking about specificity, there are some generalities that like people just should be able to do, like and that can translate into whatever you're doing. There should be, and there's certain strength standards, as an example, that I want most of my athletes to do, regardless of whether you're going to have a ball, bat, a stick, glove, whatever you're going to have on your hand when you go out and play. There's certain strength standards that I want to start hitting before we even get too specific into it. And so if you aren't hitting those, a lot of people's programs will look somewhat the same, provided that they don't have any significant restrictions that they shouldn't be doing those exercises. So it's this delicate balance of not needing to go too deep into the woods with specificity, but also not missing the big rocks that we often overlook. And I always joke that and we actually talk about it in our Principles of Program Design course, as we talk about training and the analogy to, if anybody's heard of the jar of life. Okay, the jar of life, it's a professor who originally gave this lecture talking about the meaning of life, and we just kind of stole that and use it in how it applies to training. And if you look at, you're trying to fill this jar and you have rocks, you have pebbles, you have sand. If you just fill it with all the sand first, and then you try to put in the pebbles and rocks, you're not going to fit it all. But if you put in the big rocks first, and then the pebbles and the sands, it'll all fit and it'll all match well. Now, the big rocks in life are your family, the ones you love, the things that are most close to you. Your pebbles are your career, your friends, your next layer on that ring of things. And then your sand is the day-to-day stuff. And so when I look at it with training, big rocks are, can you do basic things like What's your sleep look like? What's your breathing look like? What's your general nutrition? What's your baseline movement competency? What's your base of fitness? These are big rocks that I need to check. Then the pebbles, I can get a little bit more specific into the extreme zero activities. And then the sand is the real infinite stuff that I may never even get to with you. But we're all on Twitter arguing about sand, right? We're all on Twitter arguing about what, is the trap bar deadlift jump as good as a power clean? Well, I got a kid who can't even touch his toes. So I don't give a shit about either of them, right? I need to fix that first, right? And then I want to be able to at least get them to learn how to hip hinge. And when they can hip hinge, then I can start teaching them a deadlift and then maybe some of the things off of that. And then we can argue about that stuff. Let me get the big rocks and pebbles settled first. Because I guarantee if I walk into your facility or your weight room or your team training, that we're going to find some big rocks that you missed. And so stop arguing about the sand. If you've shown me that you've checked all those boxes first, then yeah, let's argue over beer and peanuts about the sand. And we may never come up with a right answer because we don't know, because there's too many moving parts. There's too many variables.
There definitely is. And I love that analogy that you brought up with the jar and life, with the rocks and the sand. It made me think of, I'm a huge fan of Pavel's work, and he wrote a book with Dan John a while back where he talks about what he calls easy strength. And he breaks up training into 4 main quadrants. And he said what differentiates the best and strongest athletes from those that are still just kind of lost in the weeds, for lack of a better way to put it, is the amount of time they spend in the first 2 quadrants as opposed to the second 2 quadrants. So his quadrants are quadrant 1 or Q1, which is just general physical prep, right? It's focused on lots of quality movement at a low relative max. So there's nothing wrong with, going into the gym and starting every single workout you do with 15 to 20 clean, good repetition body weight squats, right? Doing a set or 2 of 20 body weight squats every single day is not going to overload or overtrain your quads or your glutes or anything like that. It's just general physical prep. And then that leads us into stage 2, which is general strength repetition, right? So as we've talked about before, can you brace your lumbar spine? Can you actively tighten and engage your core? Can you do a basic pull-up or chin-up, just a movement pattern? Can you do the movement pattern correctly? So we moved from general physical prep to general strength prep into our 3rd and 4th quadrants. The 3rd quadrant he kind of described as a yin-yang interaction between strength training and your end goal. So now we're flirting with a goal of training. And then the 4th quadrant would be your overall goal. So maybe that's, to have the strongest deadlift in the gym, or to compete internationally for powerlifting or strongman or whatever. There's very few qualities few quantity of exercises that you're doing in that 4th quadrant, but you're doing it at a very high relative max. And if you don't have the base in the first 2 quadrants, right, your ability to generally move your body, and then the ability to hold general strength through something like an active plank or a pull-up, then you're not going to be able to do that 4th quadrant, those 4th quadrant movements as effectively as someone who had that base would.
So one of the rules I have within my all the weight rooms that I consult with high schools is that everything has a purpose, and meaning that, and that purpose is every rep, every set, every workout is with one purpose in mind, and that is to win a state championship. And so it is not to get you good at working out, right? And so when someone asks me a question about the deadlift, my first question back is going to be, well, what are you doing it for? Are you doing the deadlift to get good at the deadlift, or you're doing the deadlift to get good? Because there's a difference between the 2, right? If that is my sport because I am a power lifter, or that is part of what I'm doing as part of a CrossFit competition, then yeah, there's a different answer for that then I'm doing that to get better hip hinging, so I get in a better athletic position so I can be more explosive off the ball. And so I can't answer the question until I know what you're using it for, and then understand that everything we're doing in a weight room and on a field and on a track and as part of your training is a means to an end. That you are not here to get good at working out. You are here working out to get good. And that this is just one of the vehicles that we're using to optimize your performance. And then we have to look at the concept of minimal, maximal, and optimal. So as a minimum, yeah, there's certain minimums, as I said, I'd like to be able to do. Like as a baseline minimum, before I have my team start doing pull-ups and chin-ups, you need to be able to do a straight arm hang for 60 seconds. Well, if you can't do that, no use even trying a pull-up. And so let's check that box first. And then once we get to the ability to do pull-ups, well, how many do I need to do? And what is our goal? Are we trying to build strength? Are we trying to build size? Are we trying to build endurance? And then that's going to alter what my answer is going to be with that. And so understanding that just adding another 5-pound plate onto the bar or adding another rep, is that going to make an impact on what the ultimate goal is? And if not, then I'm at the optimal point. It's enough, right? And so putting 50 more pounds on my bench or deadlift may not make it me any better when I go out to throw a baseball, as hard as I can. So I have to ask, is that my limiting factor? And am I at the optimal part? And if I am, I got so much other stuff I need to work on that I'm not going to spend all my time just getting good at this one thing. Because there's, I have a performance pyramid that I use with my athletes, and it has, 60 different things that you need to be a great athlete. And, strength is one box, right? So once I can check that box, I'm focusing on, I'm going to do enough to maintain that strength while I'm building all those other properties.
Right. There's that therapeutic window with exercise, like you said, and you have to understand the purpose of it. And as you said, it's to get better at X, Y, or Z sport. But you also have to remember that a therapeutic window has a minimum effective dose. So you dose accordingly to get the result that you want, but you can also push it too much, and then you start to get detrimental effects, side effects, right? We think about that therapeutic window in terms of pharmacology all the time, but rarely do we see people think about it in terms of exercise and fitness, especially when they're training athletes. We often fall into the trap of more is better. And sometimes, as you said, it's all about finding what they need to do in order to perform at their best. So with that, Eric, do you have any closing thoughts or closing remarks on what we've just been discussing?
I can go a million directions, but I'm going to jump off your last point. And this is something, again, we talk about in our program design course, is that realize that everything we do has a cost, right? Nothing's free. And so when we talk about training, or we're talking about, our time invested with rehab, is that what is our cost going to be? And what is our checklist? Okay, well, we're going to have a physiological cost. And these costs aren't necessarily a bad thing, because that's a cool way that you exercise is unique, is that if you have a physiological cost and you're on a bike, right? And that physiological cost creates a response where you're more fit the next time you do that because of this stress adaptation cycle. Well, then I just have to dose that physiological cost so it's appropriate for your level of fitness, for your state of readiness, and for what your goal is. But then there's also structural cost, right? So if we don't understand that balance, what we end up doing is we end up gaining in one and losing in the other. So as an example is there's also a metabolic cost. Like we want a metabolic cost if I'm trying to shed body fat, or that's why I kind of do that. That's a good cost. Unless you're a wrestler that doesn't want to lose any more weight, right? Then I have to keep my weight at a certain point. So it's understanding those costs and checks and balances. So I had a kid that I was working with. He just actually signed his letter of intent to play Division I football. He's a big lineman, and his weight got away from a little bit. And he went to one of the camps, and one of the coaches told him, "Well, you need to drop some weight. We want to see you come in lighter." And told him he needs to start running. And thankfully, I got to him first, because he said, "Yeah, coach, they like me, but they want me to start running to lose weight." Now he's 340 pounds. His knees rub together and his feet turn out like a duck when he runs. Okay, think about the structural cost at 4 times body weight every time he takes a stride and runs, right? And so great, he'll be 20 pounds lighter and he'll have no cartilage left in his knees. Okay, so understanding that cost that's involved, and that's really about, like we started off with, assessing what are their needs, assessing where do they need to get to, and then what are the limiting factors, whether it be movement, whether it be some deficiency on that end, or whether it be a physical capacity and that sort of deficiency on that end, and then check the boxes and fill in the blanks to the optimal level for that individual. And so having these checklists is what has allowed me to create programs that are efficient and effective, and allowed me to be able to be adaptable for the different populations that we have. Because I just need to know, just always kind of lean into that checklist and say, are we getting all these boxes knocked off? Are we getting to all the places that we need to get to? And so I'm not guessing, and it's not my cool exercise versus your cool exercise, because guess what? They neither of them may work, or both may work. And so the idea is to figure out, well, why are we doing this in the first place, and how will we know when we got there?
Definitely. That's a great point to end on, Eric. Now, for people who want to find out more about you and stay up to date with all the things that you're doing, where can people find you?
Okay, so there's 2 things that I'm gonna put out there. The one is the easiest way is just my website. It's ericdagati.com, and it's ericdagati.com. Now, because I do a bunch of these and go out and speak all over, I put something right on the homepage called Ask Eric. And you just pop in a question in there. It goes directly to my email, and I'll get back to you in a couple of days, hopefully with an answer, or probably as if you've learned anything, I'm going to ask you more questions, or if not, get you to a resource that'll help you. The other thing that I keep kind of hinting at, other than the work I do with functional movement, is a course that a colleague, Mike Perry, and I have put together called The Principles of Program Design, where we talk a lot about the same things you've been asking me about, in terms of, if you were using exercise as your mode of improvement for your clients, patients, athletes, you need to be able to answer some questions. And if I were to walk in your door and ask those questions and you don't have the answers for those, well, we need to get you set up with the right principles and the right checklists, that so you can answer those questions, whether it's your client, patient, or athlete asking them of you, or you should be asking of yourself, to know that, am I doing right by this person? Am I doing the best that I can by this person? What methods you use, I don't really care. And so whether you're on the fitness side using kettlebells or Olympic lifts or West Side method, that doesn't matter to me. They're all great systems if used in the right time and place. And on the rehab side, I don't care if you use the Graston technique or ART or spinal manipulation, as long as you can know when and where to use those tools and having a principles and checklist system that you can back that up against, then you're doing a great job. And we don't need to argue about the methods. That's a beer and peanuts sand argument.
Definitely. Eric, thank you so much for your time. This was an amazing episode. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast with Eric Dagati. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a huge favor and share it with a friend or someone you know that might benefit from the information that we shared throughout it. Next, if you've been listening to our show before and you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you hit the subscribe button and check out the links below for ways that you can support our podcast. And finally, make sure you follow both myself and Eric on social media. You can check out our Instagram handles below. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.